Hey all, here at OS Reviews. In this video, we are taking a closer look at the Xgoody P30. This is an ultra-budget Android smartphone that sells for less than $70, including a gradient finish, a 6-inch display, comes in a number of different colors, and as far as the specs are concerned, it is pretty entry-level, but that's fair considering the price. Quad-core MediaTek processor, it is a dual SIM card phone, so you can pop in 2 cards. Packaging here is kind of interesting because it looks scattered. It actually comes with a back plate not included in the box. Here we have a gradient yellow and blue finish which looks dazzling. Here's kind of what it looks like from the back and also from the sides. It is made out of plastic as opposed to, say, glass. Let's just go ahead and gently peel that off. This little box contains a standard AC power brick. It just takes a USB lead. And then in this main box is where we have the smartphone itself. The phone does have a removable battery, which is rated at 2,800 milliamp hours. Not shabby, but certainly isn't going to be really an endurance champion, I'd say. There is a kind of film on top of the contacts that you need to peel off before turning the phone on. Then underneath, we have the aforementioned quick instruction manual that documents how to set up and use the phone in color. And there's also a protective screen film that you can apply. And we have the aforementioned soft TPU case. Finally, there's just the aforementioned charging cable, which is using micro USB. Snapping the back cover on, the phone does feel surprisingly hefty and sturdy, considering it has a removable back. With that being said, the gradient finish here is a huge fingerprint magnet, so it attracts smudges and dust pretty easily. The top here features a camera array. It only really has a primary camera, and in this case it's 5 megapixels. Here's what the side looks like, just very dazzling. And on the rear here we have simply the speaker and the microphone. The other right-hand spine features the volume rocker and the power key. Let's tap on this for a few seconds to turn it on. And then on the very top, we have access to a standard 3.5mm headphone jack. Always nice to see on a phone these days. And there is the aforementioned micro USB port for charging and syncing. And there is a pre-applied screen protector already, so that second one that you saw is just an extra or spare. We can gently peel this one off. And as you can see there, we already have a film on top. One thing I will say though is some of the ads make it seem like it has more of a bezel-less design just because of that kind of teardrop-ish placement for the front-facing camera. But in fact, as you can see here, it is more of a traditional display that is with a larger bezel on the top and bottom. It certainly isn't bad, especially compared to phones from just 2 or 3 years ago, but it doesn't have quite a true water drop notch display. It is a modern 2:1 aspect ratio, so it's going to be quite stretched and fits modern content without any issues, and we get a pretty nice one-handed experience even though the phone is pretty large. Now, as a size comparison here, I think one of its closer competitors would be the Ulefone Note 7, which also sells for around $70. This one does have more of a real kind of water drop notch, but the overall dimensions are not too far off, mainly just aesthetic differences from the design of the back cover and on the rear. A closer look at the software. First of all, the phone does have double tap to wake, and you can also use this screen when it's off to write a gesture like a letter to quickly launch into a certain application as a shortcut. Now, as aforementioned, the launcher here is definitely not stock. It loops around, and it's very reminiscent of the Samsung One UI for their Galaxy phones, so not everyone will be a fan of this, but if you don't like it, you can always revert to a more stock-like experience using a launcher such as Nova Launcher, as you can see here, that turns it into a more classic experience. Now you can see here that the general navigation in terms of the system is still relatively smooth, and there's not too much hesitation or delay, which is good. Now with the MediaTek chipset here, it takes a few seconds longer for it to initialize and boot when you first turn it on, and afterwards you can see here that the system performance is alright. You can also hide the bottom keys to give you a more immersive full screen experience, but there is no support in settings for things like gestures for swiping up to go home, for example. The only Google apps which are pre-installed is the Play Store and the Google app. If you want to download Assistant, if you want to download kind of Chrome, if you want to download YouTube, you have to find all of those in the Play Store, so it's extremely light. Speaking of, if we quickly jump into the settings here and tap on About Phone, we can confirm that this is kind of the model number, the Android version that it's running on, and otherwise, if we kind of jump back, we can also take a look at the memory that is available on this phone. So again, 16 gigabytes out of the box, and you get around 10 gigabytes which are remaining for you to store new applications from. Let's take a quick look at the camera. Now, I will say right away that the camera is by no means a forte on this phone. Overall camera quality is similar to other budget low-end phones, and indeed we only have one primary sensor, 5 megapixels for taking images. The interface is very simple though. We can slide back and forth to go between capturing video, photo. There is kind of a beauty mode for capturing a face. You can create a bokeh effect, but it is pretty artificial. And in addition to other settings, including panorama and also a quote-unquote pro mode that allows us to do things like change the aperture, ISO, and white balance manually. However, one feature or mode that's lacking on here is HDR. Overall, it's passable at best. It definitely isn't really a top-notch camera, and when you're outdoors, colors are all right, but details are not the most impressive thing. Would have liked to see maybe 8 megapixels at least, but still, certainly not bad. Otherwise, let's take a quick look at the web browsing performance next. Let's jump into Chrome here, and popping up the keyboard here is definitely not as fast as on more expensive flagship grade phones, but there is a haptic vibration, so the phone does buzz whenever you're typing on the keyboard and pressing the keys, but it's a little bit weak. It definitely isn't as precise. It doesn't feel as satisfying as on flagship phones with a better haptic engine. Still, it works, and same thing goes with web browsing. You can see that general performance is better than expected, considering the entry-level processor. This is a pretty complex site, but it's loading along here without too many issues, just taking a little bit while longer compared to a Snapdragon 800 series phone, but certainly isn't bad. It's also a good time to point out that the quality of the display is also not shabby. It is a IPS screen, so it does have generous viewing angles, just like other LCD displays. So in terms of tilting it off axis and looking at it from various degrees, for sure it's better than budget phones were from a few years ago that tended to have regular TN panels. So this actually looks good, doesn't seem too washed out, colors are nice and bright, and when you're outdoors, visibility is also decent. Touch responsiveness, also don't have too many complaints about. Only thing is the resolution isn't super high. It's about the same as other budget phones these days. It's slightly above 480p, so around 540p or so, but we're not talking about, full HD. It's not even 720p, so stretched across a 6-inch panel, you will definitely notice some pixelation, but if you're just casually looking at photos and doing some quick browsing, it doesn't pose too big of an issue, I'd say. With 2 gigabytes of RAM, one thing to keep in mind is that this is not going to be a multitasking champion. So you want to keep open tabs in the browser to a minimum. Ideally, I would say under 3 or 4 tabs, and then try to keep as few programs running in the background as possible to get the fastest experience. So let's do a quick test of the speakers next, just by jumping into YouTube. So a few takeaways. The speaker quality is, I would say, average or slightly below average when it comes to not having too much bass. So there's definitely not too much of a kick in the background, but what is good is it doesn't seem to distort too much even at higher volumes, and at least the mids and trebles do sound all right. So I would say fair as far as phone speakers are concerned. It is a mono speaker, but the benefit here is we do have a standard headphone jack, so you can always plug in your regular headphones, or you can connect to Bluetooth headphones and speakers if you want to improve the audio quality. In terms of the overall experience, is also not bad because of the fact the screen is pretty large in terms of size, again 6 inches, and that modern 2:1 aspect ratio with the slightly curved edges on the screen, as you can see there, is definitely still making it feel better than the specs would suggest. So if we want to quickly revisit some of these other installed applications, first of all, if we jump into CPU-Z, we can indeed confirm that it is running on the MediaTek 1.3 GHz processor. We can also see the device properties. That's the screen resolution, as you can see there, 540 by 960, the amount of memory that's remaining, and also the Android level, things like that. We can also take a look at some of the pre-installed apps, which again seem like Samsung, but they are pretty much just the regular stock versions of these apps, like the Clock app hasn't been really tweaked. It's just the icon packs are made to resemble Samsung. Just as a quick demo of 2 games, let's start with a lighter game. So here's Stack. It's not very graphically demanding. This represents lighter titles that you may want to play, like puzzle games, maybe arcade games, retro style games, and you can see that for these lighter games it does all right. Sometimes though there is still moments of hesitation with some of the graphics, seeing the phone doesn't get too hot when you're playing. It doesn't, in fact, even get too warm, so it definitely doesn't thermal throttle or anything, which is good. And when it comes to the overall kind of consistency of the experience, again, for lighter games, it definitely still does all right without too many issues. When it comes to battery life, again, it has a 2,800 milliamp hour pack, which is only average, I'd say, for a phone that has a 6-inch display. In fact, a little bit below average. In my testing, it can get me through the entire day without too many issues, but it definitely isn't an endurance champion. It's helped by the fact that the resolution of the screen is pretty low. In terms of charging back rates, though, it is actually pretty decent. I was able to get it from 0 to 100 in around 2 hours, 2.5 hours. So as far as budget phones are concerned, even if it doesn't have rapid charging or quick charge, it still is quite fair. Now here we have Sega's Monkey Ball, which represents kind of a slightly more demanding game. It still isn't as demanding as, say, kind of Asphalt 9 or 10 or kind of PUBG, but you can see here now we use the accelerometers, there's some more 3D graphics, but overall you can see how the interaction with all the game elements here is actually pretty smooth without noticing too much delay or sluggishness. So phone processors and optimization has gotten a lot better over the years. Well, even in the super budget phones these days, we are talking about pretty acceptable performance for lighter users. Playable for casual and light gamers for sure, but for heavy gamers, definitely you have to look elsewhere. So that's more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the Xgoody P30, which is this ultra budget phone, sells for only 69 bucks, it's unlocked, and has a decent, I would say, appearance in terms of giving us a pretty large display, a modern aspect ratio, and a decent overall, I would say, performance for the money for sure, if you just want something light to, of course, make phone calls, occasionally browse the web, watch videos with. It definitely fits those bills without too many issues, and it is a slight step above certain Android Go edition phones in terms of the performance, and also aided by an extra gigabyte of RAM, whereas most Android Go edition phones tend to only have 1 gig. Limitations would be the fact that the processor is still on the entry-level side, and finally, it doesn't have any kind of biometrics, including fingerprint scanners, that you can take advantage of, so you have to rely on a password or a PIN. But again, a good budget overall if you just want something that has a nice large display, if you want something that looks more expensive and just as prettier and shinier than even more expensive mid-tier phones, I think this is an interesting option. So if you're interested in that, you can check out more details in the links down below, but for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Xgoody P30.